Welcome everybody. I think we're still getting a few people grabbing their lunches. It's truly my pleasure to introduce to you today James Cantor. By way of history, he originally hails from Long Island, which we found out for the first time last night. I thought he was a true Canadian, but he was an implant like me. James did his undergraduate degree in computer science, so he might actually have a bit of a programming experience with math with a lot of our interests. He then did a master's degree at Boston University, and eventually his PhD in clinical psychology at McGill. And then he never left Canada. And he is now directing the largest sexual-based clinic in the country. And look at all those titles. So he's a... my mother is very correct. His mother is very proud. But he is an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and editor-in-chief of the premier journal on sexual abuse, a journal of research and treatment. He is he's been well cited in the public about all sorts of cases related to sexual-based offending and sexual-based treatment, or treatment for sexual-based offenders. Offenders who sexually, whatever it is, you know what I'm trying to say. And today he's going to talk to us about, and these are very, for a long time I used to think that our work in psychopathy was one of the more controversial kind of areas, but when you dabble into this type of an area, it truly can, it brings out the best and the worst of a lot of individuals and groups and other things. And I think James has done a magnificent job of managing the media, the press, and everything in order to try to achieve a better understanding of pedophilia and sex offenders against children, neuroimaging, and implications for public safety. So even though it's not as sunny as we would like today, please give them a warm New Mexico welcome.
As my parents very wisely told me, if you're going to think about sex all day anyway, get a job at it. One of the main things that's always, other than actual neuro researchers, a lot of times when I talk about what we know about what causes pedophilia and what in the brain is related to pedophilia, it's really these are the kinds of questions that are in people's minds. I mean, a lot of people have asked, is it in the genes? Well, fine, but they didn't actually mean, to a geneticist, is it in the genes is a very specific question. It's a very DNA or epigenetic kind of a, when somebody says, is it genetic, really what they want to know is, can we change it? To most people in society, genetic kind of means permanent, born with it, not your choice. Well, 10 years later, once neuroscience became really big, we get the same question, but now it takes the form of, is it in the brain? To us, is it in the brain? It's a very specific kind of question with, really what people want to know is, are they born with it? Can they change it? Can we treat it? That's really what they mean by, is it in the brain? What can we do with it? But the answer is fascinating. And I'll revisit these questions again at the end. Now, in any of these kinds of talks, it's very, very easy to slip in language. So I like to be very specific with exactly how I use terms, specifically these two. Unfortunately, people still often use the word pedophilia as a synonym for child molester, but actually they're entirely distinct. They're distinguishable. Pedophilia is the sexual interest. That's the actual, propensity to be sexually aroused by children. Child molestation, however, is the behavior. These, of course, overlap. A lot of people who commit child molestation are motivated by being sexually interested in the child, but not everyone. There are pedophiles who never do it, who never harm in any way a child. Dan Savage came up with a brilliant term for those that I've kind of stolen and have been using ever since. Gold star pedophiles. And when you think about it, if somebody, doc, I got a problem, born realizes that they're sexually attracted to children, they spend their entire lives, or at least society is asking them to spend their entire lives celibate. It's not a situation we would wish on anyone, but that's where these people have ended up. Child molesters, a large chunk of them are genuine pedophiles, but not all of them, especially incest offenders. There could be other kinds of motivations, bizarre family dynamics that lead to it. Now, technically, pedophilia, or pedophilia proper, refers to sexual interest in prepubescent children, up to about age 11, 12. There are also people, and they actually outnumber the pedophiles, who are sexually interested in pubescent age children. Not prepubescent, they don't want somebody with adult coarse pubic hair or fully developed breasts. It's usually just breast buds or the initial downy kinds of pubic hair. Then there's, we don't hear much about them, the hebephiles, who are somewhere in between, and then the regular everyday folk. Ray Blanchard got sick of calling them adultophiles. So he went back to the Greek and discovered that the Greek word for fully formed or developed is teleos, hence teleophile. And now that I'm getting eerily close to 50, I'm starting to depend more and more on this last group, the gerontophiles. Now I said that already. They're distinguishable, they overlap, but they're different from each other. Usually it's pedophilia motivating the child molestation itself. So there are two things that we therefore need to assess. We need to assess for pedophilia, which increase a person's risk of eventually committing a child molestation, but we also, most commonly, of the people who have already committed a crime, spent their time in jail, they're released, parole and probation officers and so on, which of those people are most likely to commit another crime? Specifically another sexual offense. If you look at all sex offenders, it's about 10 to 15% recidivate. It's much, much lower than what most people think. Google it and you'll find a lot of people saying that it's practically all of them. It's not. It's practically none of them. 10 to 15% and dropping, actually. So these are actually independent tasks. If somebody commits an offense and they're pedophilic, but they're at low risk to reoffend, I'm going to, if I'm the parole officer or a judge, do something very different than if someone's not a pedophile, but is likely to commit another offense. If I want to know what makes the brain of a pedophile different, now I need to look for pedophilia proper, as opposed to child molestation. So it's often very tricky, and I just want to point out that I'm actually assessing for two related but dissociable characteristics. So starting with pedophilia proper, the number one greatest predictor for this is a procedure we call phalometry, measuring the penis. No magic to it. There was once a porn film where there was a professor who, I'll say, orally examined subjects in order to find differences in the penis size. It was The Slutty Professor. It was the movie, in case anybody wants to look it up. So the procedure itself is called phalometry or penile plethysmography, blood flow. Essentially, it's a psychophysiological technique, and it's the most obvious test in the world. The guy is hooked up to some equipment like that. He puts his penis through, this is kind of a metal ring, donut shape, with literally an inside-out condom wrapped around it. The guy puts his penis through the donut shape, through the middle of that, and that glass cylinder goes over the whole thing. This is elastic, so when we inflate it, it seals the air in the cylinder. And then, as he gets more of an erection, it pushes air out of the cylinder, and that's what we can measure. So we're measuring the actual amount of blood volume that enters the penis, while we'll be showing pictures of adults, of children, males, females, and neutrals. And as we say, Bob's your uncle, the category he responds to most is the category he responds to most. This is a picture of my research assistant, the subject. And you can see the screen's very much like this, 3 of them, so it actually fills the subject's visual field. There's really not much outside of it that you can't see. And listens to auditory narratives describing sexual interactions with whatever the subject of that stimulus category is. The control equipment is here in the foreground, and on the screens, for today's purposes, I'm using neutral stimuli, except for the middle one, we lied. It's a horseshoe. Kurt Freund, who founded the lab, decided the horseshoe pointing down was unlucky, so it was a physical slide, so he actually turned it around in the projector. Okay, and that's how the equipment itself goes. That's the inflatable ring over our model of the penis. Should have done it with a dildo, I guess. Inflated, and that's the whole thing inflated inside the cup. And you can see the tube on top where air getting pushed out of the cylinder goes to the transducers. Now, as I said, we do it both audio and visual. So the story is a narrative depicting interactions with the kid, and we use 7 stimulus categories. So it's For the pedophiles, it's prepubescent children. For the hebephiles, the pubescent children. And then the teleophiles or adultophiles. So we have that 3 age groups, both male and female, and then a second category, neutral stimuli. There's nothing magical to it. Again, I had to white it out because America is America. But there's nothing particularly sexual about it. It's not really pornography. It's just there in order to make sure that the guy is focusing on age group we need him focused on. The stories themselves are namby-pamby from the point of view of a pedophile. I don't have a microphone here, so I can't play it, but we had the female stories are spoken in the female voice, the male stories are spoken in a male voice, completely devoid of emotion. That was a specific instruction of ours to the actors who read the scenarios for the recordings. You're watching a late movie on TV with your neighbor's 12-year-old daughter. You have your arm around her shoulders and your fingers brushed against her chest. You realize that her breasts have begun to develop. The stories are very specific to the age group we're going with. So there are particular references in the hebephilic stimuli about breasts begun to develop, as opposed to cupping her fully formed breasts, or to rubbing her smooth chest, and so on. Now, usually we would think if we're talking 2 sex orientations, male versus female, and for these purposes 3 age orientations, prepubescent, pubescent, and adult, you would think that the results would fit neatly in a 2x3. Turns out that's not the natural structure of human sexual interest, or at least the structure of human age and sexual interest. It turns out to be one line. It's one-dimensional. It's also not the pattern you would think. You would think that it would be, male, young, middle, old, female, young, middle, old, or something different. But it's not. It's almost this mirror image with the kid categories in the middle. Because when you test people, this first group, these are rapists of adult women. So everybody in the sample that I pulled from our database to create the spread, these are people who are, if they're raping 3 or more adult women, their favorite category, surprise, surprise, is adult women. But their second highest response is not 0. It's the next highest category, which looks the most like the preferred category, which is the next youngest female, and then the youngest females. But the responses to these 2 are practically identical. When I look just at men who have offended 3 or more times against a female, that's the P category. Again, no surprise. But there's no difference between these 2 categories. If a person is at the most extreme, he has nowhere to go but down, literally. But this way, there are 2 ways that a person can be different from their favorite sexual object. They can be either too old or too young. If your favorite is, although I suppose if I added gerontophilia to it, I would get a decrease that way. But still, these are closer. They're not opposites. These are offenders against male children, and the second highest is the female children, and these are regular gay men. Now, a lot of us think, why would the offenses against the male children be so close to the female children? Because we naturally think of male as opposite of female. It's adult male is opposite of adult female. But a prepubescent kid, cut the hair, change the clothes, one looks just like the other. Or let the hair grow and change clothes. So to whatever set of feature detectors the brain is looking for in order to identify a viable sexual partner, or whatever stimuli should therefore trigger the subsequent sex response system, the stimuli of prepubescent male children is very close to the stimuli being presented by a male child. It's only the adults that are opposite. The kids are actually very close together. So, which is essentially what I said, there's actually very little distance, and so we graph it this way, where the ones that are closely related are positioned in our one-dimensional graph closely, but it's adult male and adult female that are the opposites. Now, these are the major ways that we use to assess risk to reoffend. And these are all, nowadays, actuarial instruments. In the old days, it was whatever shrink sitting in office, like this one in, that one out. It was quite subjective and not at all validated. They, since those days, developed these specific instruments which look at very specific, identifiable characteristics of the person, of the offender, and of their previous pattern of offenses. You follow them up 5 to 10 years, depending on the study, and looked which characteristics would have predicted the future offenses. And since most of this is done retrospectively, it takes a large amount of coding, and we already know at the end who did reoffend. The most common of these is called the static 99. It's been revised. It's been attempted to be revised a couple of times, and there are the usual controversies around it. But really, all the different instruments use some form of the same kinds of questions. And as you might remember, they're all pulling at the same kind of variance. So larger questions will give you more variance, but sometimes it becomes a little bit random. And sometimes questions you would think would be there aren't, because it's absorbing the same variance as one of the things that are there. But the basic ideas are, young men are the most likely to commit new offenses between 18 and 25. So the thing has only been validated for people over 18, so it's just null after people under. Having a romantic partner, living together 2 or more years. You get a point if you if you have a live-in or romantic partner, then you get the 0. You're less likely to commit one. If you have not found a woman who thinks you're worth living with, you're in trouble. Prior sex violence, again, people who did it before are more likely to do it again. Prior sentencing dates, which almost sounds like another way of counting offenses, but it doesn't. Offenses tend to happen in clusters. So if there was a cluster of offenses that were convicted, in jail, out of jail, and there's a whole new cluster, so when you're sentencing date, that's a better predictor than the actual number in the cluster itself. Non-contact offenses are more likely to redo, are also more likely to commit another offense, which is kind of confusing. We usually think of physical touching as a more heinous crime, therefore they'd be more likely to redo it. Turns out it's the non-contact offenders are more likely to redo it. Exhibitionists and voyeurs, because that's easy to redo, it's quick, they're less likely to be captured, and so they're more likely to do it again after their release. Offenders against non-family victims are more likely. Offenders against strangers are more likely. People with male victims are more likely to reoffend than people with female victims. And of course, having prior sex victims, the larger your history, the more likely you're going to do it again and again. The follow-up, as I say, was actuarial. The scale is relatively simple, although there are lots of details about exactly how to code it. In the original norming sample, which had just over 1,000, they were tracked over 5 years. And it was, like I say, 10 to 15% recidivate. This was done, we're now going a couple of years ago, and new ones, and the attempts to replicate this. This number keeps going down. This one was 18, and as the years go by, sex offenses are, except for child porn on the internet, all sex offenses are decreasing in frequency. They've been decreasing in frequency for about 20 years. All crime has been decreasing in frequency for about 20 years and continues to be a mystery. Follow up after 10 years, of course, it's non-monotonic, the numbers have to be higher, but not very much higher. The offenses, the people who were going to reoffend tended to reoffend relatively quickly after re-release. These are the same numbers, but for violent offenders, violent offenses. They're actually more likely to commit a violent offense than another sexual offense. Okay, so that brings us up to the part that I always find interesting. What makes these people tick? I mean, really, really tick. Now, although most audiences kind of grew up on the abused abuser hypothesis, that pedophiles were themselves abused as children, so there's a like begets like, Freud happened, and that was just kind of taken for granted, not questioned for a long time. Actually, the first theory was that it was neurological. This guy, Epping, invented the word pedophilia. Some people say that he invented the entire field of sexology with the publication of that book, Psychopathia Sexualis, which was so torrid in those days that he had to write it in Latin. That way, the uneducated wouldn't be polluted by its contents. And in it, he came to the conclusion that, indeed, not only pedophilia, but all the sexual anomalies were essentially neurological. And as I say, Freud happened 20 years ago, and it shut down most thinking for about a century. Who being anti-Freudian? Now, even though there was no research, and we certainly didn't have the equipment really to look at the brain for many years after Kraft Ebing, what we did have is a lot of IQ tests. Now this started, again, the first ones started in the 30s, which is when, remember Kinsey was collecting those enormous numbers of surveys of people's sexual interests. That was in the mid-20th century. That's how science was done. It was done in these enormous surveys where they tried to get information on large groups of people. And so prisons did it. So there was study after study just breaking down these kinds of offenders, those kinds of offenders. Everybody in New York State, there's a report. Everybody who was in California, there was a report. So I was able to pull it, and among the tests were IQ scores. So I was able to pull out of that just the sex offenders and to compare them to everybody else, and then one big hunk of meta-analysis. And that's what I got. Again, this is K, not N, so that's number of studies, not number of individuals within the samples. And these weren't diagnosed as pedophiles, but they were offenders against children. And sure enough, remember, normal IQ is about 100, standard deviation of 15, and so on. The offenders against children came out the lowest. The offenders against adults were higher, but really, versus the other kinds of offenders, so everybody was in jail, everybody was caught. This isn't about offenders against children being dumber, therefore captured. Everybody was captured. But the offenders against children had lower IQs in, as I say, enormous samples conducted over most of the 20th century. This one was, I'll call it a nail in the coffin. Usually, the legal system does not define child in the same way that scientists would define child. And different studies, when they say offenders against children, sometimes it's an offender against children, meaning somebody under 18. Some people, it's an offender against children 16 or under, 14 or under. All I did is graph the mean IQ of the sample with their definition of child. The more stringent the definition of child, the lower the mean IQ of the sample. So this wasn't just about being apprehended. They were all apprehended. There's something about the nature of the victims that they were choosing to offend against. Okay. Most of over the 80s and 90s or so, there were, and I just kind of nicknamed, they were the temporal lobe theorists and the frontal lobe theorists. The frontal lobe theorists are probably what you're already thinking, that, okay, these people are unable to inhibit their sexual interest in children, that's why they're committing their offenses. Personally, I never bought that theory. I mean, if I asked a regular, everyday guy, how do you suppress your sexual reactions to children? They'll look at you like you have three heads. There's nothing to suppress. There are no sexual interests in children. There's nothing to inhibit it, nothing to inhibit, nothing to disinhibit. The other group, the temporal lobe theorists, again, I nicknamed them temporal lobe, really it's limbic. They're saying, well, that's kind of 4X, feeding, flighting, what am I missing? Feed, flight, oh goodness, and sex. So they were the gang who were anticipating that something would be off in the limbic system, because that's where the sex system was. More reasonable to me. I was pretty agnostic about it when I started all this, but that's, if I was anything, I was going to be a temporal lobe theorist. Now in those days, they still didn't have high-resolution scans, but they did have large neuropsychological batteries, much like the IQ studies that were done before that. The most common ones, and they actually were some of my predecessors at CAMH, and they used the Lyra Nebraska battery and the House Degree 10 for whatever they're worth. Nothing. I got, lower general performance scores, but certainly nothing specific, and nothing nearly specific enough that would help us differentiate frontal versus temporal limbic versus any other part of the brain. Individual neuropsychological tests were also done, relatively standard batteries, some which tap into the frontal lobe more, now it's known to be more complicated. But what happened here was really kind of a side effect. These are the studies, the ones that are now highlighted, that found significant differences between the groups. And this drove me nuts writing this literature. Everybody would cite the significant ones, but nobody ever pointed out that the significant ones were outnumbered 3 and 4 to 1 by values to replicate. And they would then just cite only the significant frontal lobe test, trail making and so on, or only the significant temporal lobe test, memory or whatever. But nobody was describing a big picture. And then I found that there was a confound. The studies that found a significant difference found a significant difference in everything they looked at. The ones that found no significant difference found no significant difference in anything they looked at. It was a power problem. I just had one great big, just like IQ, global deficit. And if they had a large N, they found a difference in everything they tested. If they had a small N, they found a difference in nothing they tested. But everybody keeps, and today still there are many people citing these as examples of a particular part of the brain or a particular function of the brain. But really the bottom line is still just generally something's wrong and nothing specific. There were CT studies going on at the time, same story. Just, it was on the page, it's a little hard to see here, but they said enlarged ventricles was the conclusion. Thanks. So that then brought us up to 2000 essentially, where I had the opportunity, just because of the lab that I was in, they weren't doing any neuropsych testing at the time, but wanted to start doing it, and we saw in my facility, where I still am, about 250, 300 sex offenders per year. So it would not take long, once we instituted, standard clinical testing, that the N just blossoms. So the first major one we did was IQ. Now that I had phallometric testing on everybody, I didn't have to categorize them according to their offenses, which just approximates their sexual interests. I had the test results of their phallometric test telling me much more precisely exactly what their sexual interests were. And just like before, although the effect sizes are larger because I think people are better characterized, the pedophiles, not far out of the normal or average range, but very significantly lower. Hebephiles in the middle, and the teleophiles, practically indistinguishable from 100. Verbal memory, same pattern. So it's nothing specific to the IQ, which is really just an amalgam of other subtests anyway. Same thing with visual memory, over and over again. Then we started getting, okay, I have brains here in adulthood, after being caught, after going through jail, after whatever stresses of incarceration, after whatever impoverished environments, after whatever depression's going on. All right, am I seeing something that's related to pedophilia, or am I seeing something that's related to everybody who went to jail? So the next set of variables I wanted to look at, ultimately I wanted to know where in development did they start to go wrong. I don't like to say wrong, different. So standard part, it was already part of our battery. School failures, which changed, I don't know, about mid-70s. Older than that, you'd fail a grade if you failed a grade. Instead, you were put in special education, you were reassigned. My favorite thing, Bart Simpson said it best. We're behind everybody else, so we're going to catch up by going slower. Special education. So all I had to do was combine. People who failed grades, with people who were sent to special education classes. Same pattern, but what I really didn't expect, 60 and 70%. The base rate for this is like 2%. Something's going on, and this is now 10, 20, 30 years before the offense. And I have no reason to think that these people would be lying to me and saying that they failed a grade when they didn't. And it's the same pattern. No real difference here. This one startled me. Regular everyday controls, 30% of them. The base rate is like 2-3%. So these were teleophilic non-offenders, but they were a clinical sample. They were just people in our clinic, leftover category. They were people in our clinic, but in there for some reason other than the sex offense. Most of them were sexual compulsive or something else going on. Yep.
Were these, this is a Canadian sample?
Yes, this is everybody in the, these are the folks that were sent to us, which are practically all from the Greater Toronto area. Anybody know what the IQ difference is between the US and Canada?
I wasn't going there.
That's why I am.
I was really, the question was more about if you have a general offending sample, because I spent 7 years in maximum security in Canada, and it was very common for the average Canadian offender who had an IQ roughly 95 to indicate they've been held back, even non-sex offenders.
Yep.
So my only question is, if you added another column for, offenders but non-sex related, is that?
Oh, right. Yes, they wouldn't. You're correct. They wouldn't come to my lab because we only test the sex offenders.
But I would say that it's probably a pretty high. I would say it's a fairly high rate, not about 2%. It's much higher than.
Yes,
the general
although it
population
wouldn't explain this pattern.
Sure.
So it's certainly there. I would expect it to be there for non-sexual offenders, but you're absolutely right. I don't have that data, or to see by how much, in what proportion that would change this. For me, really, the important part was that whatever it was that made them different, it was kind of, like when you background radiation, look far in the telescope, you're seeing the past. That's really what I liked about that particular variable. Accidents causing unconsciousness, so head injuries. But these were relatively severe head injuries. If they weren't knocked out from the event, we didn't take it. But we asked the question in two different ways. Before and after, or at least we divided the data according to when they were 13. The pattern was there, but only for head injuries that happened before age 13, not after. Same thing. I don't quite believe that there was anything about the head injury that caused the pedophilia. I think they were just kind of spacey and more accident prone and ended up in more accidents. But it's happened 10, 20, 30 years before the events. Whatever made them different, it's earlier than high school. It's now at least before, has to be before age 13. This one is the one that really got us going. This is another one that turned out to be really important. There's a difference in height, physical height, which I say self-consciously. The amount by which the pedophiles are too short is 2.5 centimeters, which, just to ground it, that's about double the effect that would emerge if the mother smoked when she was pregnant. Whatever it is that it wasn't just their brains that developed funny, their bodies also didn't develop quite optimally. So in looking for things that might be causing this, I need to be looking for something, or at least I need to be considering global effects. It doesn't have to be specific of the brain, to the brain. It could be something general, including the brain. But the one that hooked me to the earliest part of life was handedness. And anybody here studying handedness? Dexterity? Sinistrality? I always prefer the word sinister. Which I also say self-consciously. Found it again. Now, the base rate for non-right-handedness is 8 to 12%. Over 30 for the pedos. Nobody gets 30%. The only other groups that gets non-right-handedness at that rate are autism, schizophrenia, and Florida injuries where somebody has to be retrained. But the schizophrenia. So whatever happened, it's pretty inescapable that it involves the brain. Nobody learned to be non-right-handedness. To the extent that there's a social bias, it's towards the right hand, not away from it. And handedness is necessarily pre-birth. Fetuses have a preference for which thumb they suck that can be observed in utero, that later in life becomes their natural handedness. So that was my first window. Whatever happened, whatever chain of events it is that later ended in pedophilia, the first link in that chain was before birth. That doesn't mean that pedophilia was necessarily prenatal. It could be vulnerability, susceptibility is what is pre-birth, then add whatever ingredients later ends up in it. But whatever the chain of events is, the first link in the chain was before birth. Okay, so that's what everything that we had so far, and then that was enough for the first big brain studies. Which is essentially a way of asking, can I replace the famous biometric chair with, of course, the real equipment? We've replaced that chair. It just got old, it got kind of worn, a lot of peels. And then we thought, what do we do with it? Can we sell it? And then we thought, eBay. And we thought, do we tell people the history of the chair? Turns out that jacks the price way up. There have only been 3 studies using a structural MRI on samples of pedophiles and sex offenders against children, which continues to floor me. This is one of those, find me a human who's not concerned with figuring out how this works and therefore coming up with a way of preventing the development of pedophilia. And it's just my group in Toronto and 2 other groups in Germany. That's it. Nobody in the US until today. And by sheer luck, they weren't working together, they weren't communicating with each other, but they ended up running in I'll call it a natural experiment. One of these groups was a set of frontal lobe theorists, and the other group was a set of temporal lobe theorists. Perfect. They used relatively small samples, and they also did small volume corrections. They didn't have the large N that would be necessary to correct for the entire brain. So because they were hypothesis-driven, just looked at the specific areas that they were hypothesizing, and found it. Same basic idea with Schiffer's group, small volume corrected, and they declared it was frontal. Now, by sheer coincidence, again, we were working completely independently. But it kind of, and I got to read their papers before mine was done, and I keep a copy of this on my wall. The famous old parable about the blind monks and the elephant. There are a bunch of monks, one is at the tail, he says, oh, it feels the hairs, oh yes, an elephant must be much like a brush. But then there's another monk and he's at the side, and he says, no, clearly an elephant is much like a wall. There's somebody at the leg, you feel around it, no, obviously, an elephant must be much like a tree. Trunk. But really, it's not that any one of them was wrong, but it takes, it's until somebody can look at the entire picture all at once and make each of the individual observations correct. So I don't know that either of the German teams was wrong, but I was wondering, are we just, and it happens all the time, is this just junk data? Crapshoot, small volume correction, torturing the data, and I got something so they could publish it. Or are they clues, and we have to now figure out how do these clues fit together. And that's the situation in which my study ended. I had a larger grant than they did. Actually, I don't think they had a grant at all of those times, so I was able to collect a much larger sample, prospectively over 100 people, which just shut them up quickly. I also was, as I say, kind of agnostic about where in the brain I thought there would be differences. Like I said, I was biased towards temporal and limbic theorists, but basically I was atheoretical, and I had the statistical power to look at the whole brain. Seemed like a perfect situation to solve the puzzle. Now, there's more than one way to skin. I almost wanted to say skin a cat's tail. Do you know where the expression comes from, skinning a cat? Because everybody just kind of, it's catfish. There's more than one way to skin a catfish. Okay, there's more than one way in these days to have analyzed data. BVM was just being developed. The other way that was automated parcellation. We had a neuroanatomist trace out, on a stock brain. I don't know how she did this, tracing every slice to every brain and then would morph it and so on. We don't have time to go over each of them, so I'm just going to go over the BVM methods. And there's also more than one way to decide who is and is not a pedophile. You can use just people who admit to being a pedophilic, but you end up with a very small sample. You can do offense history, which is a decent approximation in some samples, and of course but if you combine them, you can get a decent size sample of them. You can also do it with telemetry, but that one is a little bit more complicated. So for today's purposes, I'm sticking to those 2. So the subjects, regular everyday subjects, regular everyday exclusion criteria, and I can't find my bloody slide where I put the actual scanning parameters, but it's in the paper. I can send it to you if you like. And these were their backgrounds. No differences in ages, no differences in IQ or education. And I always wait for somebody to ask, wait a minute, you said there is a difference in IQ and education. These are now volunteers. So the bias is very different than when I get everybody coming through the lab. People who volunteer, we pay them whatever it was, $100 to go through the rest of it. The volunteers are much more, I want to know what's going on. It's a higher class of pedophile. But for handedness, it wasn't samples too small for it to be significant, but I still have the handedness of finding, as you would expect. This was significant. Alcohol use. But it was in the reverse direction. It was the non-pedophiles who drank more. And since I'm pretty convinced that alcohol does not cause brain growth, I felt pretty safe just continuing on. And that's what I found. Nothing. And in these days, nobody was looking at white matter. And it was just, I'm pulling my hair out. That's when I started turning gray. And, my RAs, because they were good RAs, just continue with running the analyses, which included white matter. Now I found a way. I went from absolutely nothing in gray matter to these enormous, here's the top view, C-shaped areas connecting lots of stuff. Huge, absolutely huge. The effect sizes at any given voxel wasn't very large, but the number and the extent of the voxels was huge, and following, pretty decently well-known anatomic structures. Specifically, same thing, just sliced differently, so we could name them for the anatomists who could recognize them. And certainly will be able to see it better than I can. That's just the top of the caudate, which identified this C-shaped thing as the superior occipital frontal fasciculus. It took me weeks to learn that. And then this extra part, you can see the extra blob in the right hemisphere. And this is just an oblique slide to give us a picture of that. For other audiences, I just tell everybody it looks like Marge Simpson with a frying pan. Saying it? And that's the right arcuate fasciculus, which kind of fascinated me because I always loved the left arcuate fasciculus. You remember what's the name of that aphasia where if it's cut, they could do everything except repeat what you tell them? I haven't heard of that? Oh, it's one of my favorites. The left arcuate fasciculus connects Broca's and Wernicke's area, and if it's severed or damaged, speech production is normal, speech perception is normal, speech reception is normal. But if you ask the person, repeat after me, and say, once upon a time, they'll say, a very long time ago. They heard me. They understood me. They understood the content of it, but they could not duplicate the words. So when I first heard that in grad school 300 years ago, when I first realized that the brain does not work the way it feels like it works, and it doesn't. Because the reception and the production and reception areas, once they're severed, they couldn't just give a direct signal. He couldn't repeat the terms, but all of the vast network behind it and all the cognitive stuff still happened, so all the back ways that those two areas can be connected were still connected. So it's through the semantic process, into semantic processing and out of semantic processing, that was intact. That's why he could tell me a long, long time ago, the idea was there, the semantics were there, but the words were lost. I can't even imagine that. You get the idea but lose the words? Does that count as hearing? Anyway, so that's the left arcuate fasciculus. Nobody knows what the right arcuate fasciculus does. There's some noise about thinking that it's related to tone deafness. But that's really all we know about it. Or at least that's all I know about it. Okay. What on earth could any of that have meant for pedophilia? Now again, we're going back 5 years now. Nothing was related to white matter. Everything, in those days, we were really only talking about gray matter, and this was, just by sheer fluke, happened to have come out early, and now we have a lot of people talking about disconnection syndromes. But the way that it kind of clicked for me then is just, one of those times you get lucky, the right papers are on your desk at the same time, wait a second, and all of a sudden, everything fit together. This other side is one of the early DTI studies, which was just tracing the extent of the superior occipitofrontal fasciculus. The paper that helped fit all this together for me was a series of researchers at the same time were trying to figure out what in the brain responds to sex. Now, where's the sex center? Turns out there was no sex center. It's a sex network. There were, depending on the studies, and now the fMRI meta-analyses are now getting done, about 6 areas of the brain reliably light up over and over again. I couldn't find a good way to get 6 areas on this. The areas essentially were visual processing, and as I realized what they were, they all made sense. Visual processing, guys looking at porn. Yes, the visual processing is going to light up. Sensory integration, also not a surprise. Up on top, we get both the superior and inferior parietal lobules. he's imagining physically interacting with the person of the fantasy, and then prefrontal areas. Actual suppressing, because it's the guy in the scanner, and he really is suppressing his sexual reactions, but the rest of the stuff is still going on. So the hunch, hypothesis, explanation, post hoc idea I got was that, oh, it's not that there's an area of the brain that's causing pedophilia, but if there's no single sex area and instead it's a sex network, if the sex network isn't cabled together properly, the system is responding when it otherwise should be filtering out the stimulus. We have, a normal set, most species do, higher species do, a normal set of social instincts. Short, eyes large relative to head, you become parental protective avuncular. Somebody large and intimidating, you either run away or obey them. Food, we eat it. But if in this one, instead of seeing the kid, instead of that triggering the protective social instincts, it triggers the sexual social instincts, like a literal cross-wiring. I have no idea how close the physical analogy gets to a cross-wiring, but it sure fits it. So far that's really that's the idea going on in my head, is that we have a series of sensory inputs that are processed, and when they're in the right combination, neural network, it triggers the next line down. Well, if one of these sets of fibers, tracks, projects too far, not far enough, there are too few of them, so it's not able or not accurately able to differentiate, react to this but not that, and it sends the signal down the line when it ought to be filtering that one out. Still don't know if it's true, but it's certainly worth following up, which is very close to where we are now. But it does bring us to, well, what do I do with my elephant? Which is really two different questions. It's not so much, am I right, or the Germans right, which Germans are right. It's really these two questions. Why didn't the two German teams find the white matter that I did? And why didn't I find the gray matter areas, both frontal and temporal, that they did? I think this one actually is, one question at a time, this one I think is more straightforward. I think it's a power problem. I had a larger sample, and as I said before, at the voxel level, there was not a huge effect size. But once you have the power to find that effect size, you got it over very, very large areas of the brain. So I think they just didn't have the N in order to see the white matter. But then why didn't I find the gray matter? Can't be a power problem. I had quadruple the subjects that I did. I had the power to find very subtle things. What I think the trick there was, or the problem, is that we used different control groups. Both German teams used regular, everyday, healthy controls recruited from the community, but I used people who committed non-sexual offenses. So I had a forensic control group for my forensic target group, and they used a non-forensic group. Plus, the areas that they found are also the areas that are related to antisociality. So I don't think that they found pedophilia areas. I think they found psychopathy and antisociality areas. Because mine was, it wasn't controlled. It wasn't consciously controlled. I mean, I didn't have to take a questionnaire or a scale to tell me how antisocial or how psychopathic the group was. But I held the bottom relatively high. We're running out of time. 5 minutes, something like that. So that was my supposition for why they found the areas that they did. They were related to antisociality rather than pedophilia. So then that brings us up to, can I use this as a diagnostic test? Essentially, can I replace philometry? Even though I can't do it with structure, the effect sizes aren't too large, but if I show somebody adults, show somebody children, I can see to which category they light up, and that might be a diagnostic test. Of course, I don't have to explain this to you folk. And there have been now about a half dozen studies that have tried this. None of them have come up with a good answer yet. The first four, these first four, They weren't trying to develop, they didn't use a method that would tell them if this could be used as a diagnostic test. They used whole brain analyses, which then reduced, the statistics, which then told them which areas of the brain would differ when. That's fine, but that capitalizes on chance. In order to use this as a diagnostic test, I need a particular point or a particular uniform way of getting down to one piece of data to see when the person was responding and when not. But that's not how they were designed, because they used whole brain analyses. And there was one that just drove me nuts. Oh, it's the next one. I'll get to it in a second. But the early ones, their main research question really was, do pedophiles respond in the same area of the brain as non-pedophiles do? Well, it's a good question, but it's a really bad scientific question. They were trying to prove a null hypothesis. You can't do that. Or you at least wouldn't want to do that. The Sartorius paper was the one, because it picked one particular point, those numbers can be translated into sensitivity and specificity and can produce a diagnostic test. But their problem is homosexual pedophiles and heterosexual controls. So when they find a difference, are they finding pedophilia or are they finding homosexuality? So they just couldn't do it. Which brings us down to, and it just came out 2 months ago, they did do it. They got picked relatively complicated way, but they did pick a specific fixed set of points, and diverse pedophiles, diverse controls fine, but found that they were really quite accurately able to differentiate on an individual person basis which ones were pedophilic and which ones weren't. But they only tested emitters, which was something that was necessary in the forensic context where they were. Well, there's no point to finding out which of the people who admit to pedophilia are pedophiles. So these numbers will, and we don't know by how much. If we use them with deniers, we don't know by how much lower it will be, but that process is on the correct track. And then it becomes a matter of comparing how accurate is that test versus the existing test we have for philometry. I always found it really, really useful to embed all of this in kind of routine medical tests, just to kind of give us an idea of how accurate they all are. One of the most accurate tests going is the HIV antibody tests. So I put it way up on this end. Way down on that end, again, men over 40, digital exam of prostate, come the good way. It's used sometimes as a screening test, but really it's just if you fail that test, they send you on to that many more tests. This is where philometry is in our lab, where we compare the phallometric results with people who had large numbers of events. 61% sensitivity. If a person is a pedophile, we pick that up 61% of the time. And 96% specific. So if a person is not a pedophile, the test will say not a pedophile 96% of the time. Because those numbers are unequal, that's an indication that the test is biased. We bias the test on purpose in favor of the patient. So if the test says they're a pedo, they're a pedo. If the test says they're not a pedo, could go either way.
James, yeah. But what about trying to measure countermeasures and stuff like that? If somebody, this is what they meant for sex offenders doing, phallometric assessment would always say that they would just do their very best to try to ignore the stimuli and try to do this. And so, but obviously, if you try to do something like that to focus on something that differently, it would have a very different EEG signature, for example.
Yes, that's one of the fascinating parts. Is that in phallos, all we get is the penis doesn't change in volume at all throughout the categories, which is actually hard to do for an hour-long test. It's interesting, but you're correct. There's no way of detecting the effort of faking. But in fMRI and ERP and so on, that's in the cards.
But you could do phallometric testing. You presumably you could do it in the scanner too. But if you did it, if you routinely recorded EEG, you could use it to develop a classification that was usually that good. But then you might be able to differentiate, individuals who are denying, based on, and you would just tell them the data, the scanner saying that, especially if it's therapeutic, to say this. It says that you're countermeasures. You're not allowing yourself to study these. You're doing something else.
Yes, it's a brilliant idea, and I think that's exactly the direction that we're going to be going with. The only piece I would take back is I don't think it's going to be realistic to get the phallometric equipment into the. It's hard enough, the goggles, the ultrasound, you horny? you know, in addition to having this stuff, so it's a theoretical possibility. I could be wrong, you know, but it's going to take, you know, a postdoc per patient to test these people. It's but I can't imagine
postdocs are for.
the way that I would start. I wouldn't start it with pedos. I would start it just differentiating gay versus straight. And do that as a proof of principle. And if that works, you know, that gives us a chance to work out the texture,
Sure.
and then try to get the tougher ones. So the Sartorius study, the one that used the one center point of the amygdala, 67%, 67%. Again, it's just not wouldn't be it's not a large enough effect size in order to be an effective diagnostic test.
So,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, but there's also in imaging we can do something it's called near-infrared spectroscopy. It's essentially you can bounce a laser off the head, and as blood flow changes, you can detect changes in blood flow at this at the cortical level. One could imagine that would be easily able to be done across the genitals to identify changes in blood flow, which is ostensibly going to lead to an erection. And you could do that potentially much less invasively than this technique. Carla, have you seen anyone try to do that?
There's something similar that was attempted in women.
Sure. So
increased blood flow. Again, actually, it was I think it was just infrared.
Yeah.
It was just measuring temperature.
Sure. Yeah.
That would be. I'd have to see what the time scale was. You know, as detumescence occurs, if the actual physical cooling is fast enough for it to differentiate to make meaningful, discrete trials. That'd be interesting. I'll have to think about that. And then this newest one up here. This is the newest one, the Ponseti study, which reported 88 to 100% sensitivity and specificity. That's a decent test. The only problem with it, as I said before, is they used emitters rather than deniers, just because of the nature of the facility that they were in. But if they can get, you know, and I'm sure there'll be some deflation, which always happens with replications, and when they do deniers who are either trying to deny or able or have learned or have been trained to decrease their responses. But, you know, the bottom line is they're getting close. We're getting close. The field is getting close. Which brings us then back to the big questions. Sure as hell looks like it's in the brain. If it's not, one's going to have an awfully hard time really explaining any of these data. Can we treat it? Doesn't look like it. Neuroplasticity be damned. I haven't seen somebody change things on the scale of difference on which we found them. Genes, still an unexplored study. Pedophilia does seem to, sex offending seems to run in families. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's genetic. We don't, a lot of these people come from very chaotic families. So kind of chaotic families beget chaotic families, and that seems to be what's getting transmitted rather than a gene. Born with it, it's hard to whatever, you know, at least a susceptibility they appear to have been born with. We don't know if it's destined by birth, but another old saying in medicine. Early in a disease, it's hard to diagnose but easy to treat. Later in the disease, it's easy to diagnose but hard to treat. So I would predict some kind of compromise between where, at what point, how early in development. If we know, you know, long before the kid has a sex drive at all, where they're going, we have an opportunity to give them the skills early on to lead an events-free life. Can it change? Like changing gay to straight. Nobody's found such a way. Responsibility is the big trick. Because people still confuse pedophilia with child molestation, a lot of people mistake this kind of research for excusing pedophiles. Pedophilia is not their fault, but that doesn't mean that they're not in control of what they do. The molestation is entirely, as best we can tell, within their control, except, you know, with exceptions. But the pedophilia itself doesn't. But the big question is, can we prevent it? If we figure out whatever the chain of events is, you know, maternal stress, poor nutrition, you know, whatever it is that changes the fetus to make them non-right-handed, lower IQ, and so on, perhaps we can affect it very, very early. So, study that I'm running now, I'm looking for other things that are different in the body that can't be misreported and are present at birth. Minor physical anomalies, excessive distance between the eyes, webbing between toes and fingers. Minor physical anomalies that are not themselves disorders, but tell us that something was off during development. And different parts of the body, of course, develop at different times during birth, so the pattern might even give us an idea of where during gestation the problems might be starting. Diffusion tensor imaging, I just finished collecting data. I can't wait to start getting my teeth on it. Magnetization transfer imaging is also very effective, very useful with white matter findings. Question I still have, I've now differentiated repeatedly the pedophiles from non-pedophiles, but pedophilia is not the only way to be sexually atypical. There are also people into cross-dressing. There are people into feet. There are people into being animals. There are people who want to look like a baby instead of... So the question is what I found general to all of these sexual atypicalities, or is it specific to pedophilia? Next, I have to start going to some pretty bizarre parties in order to I don't mind going to the parties, I just don't know what to wear. And then empirical tests of these other compounds which can cause similar kinds of disorders. I need to control for those. And now, of course, one of the big questions is, can I redo what Ponseti did, but with actual deniers? I always like to end with Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a famous sex researcher in the early 20th century. He was in Berlin. He's often credited with being the first gay rights activist. And then Hitler happened with that. But justice through science. I mean, how could you deny a grant to that? And these are my peeps. This is my gang, ever growing. And it's one of those, doing this research is fascinating. But I'm a sex guy. I know my way around the brain, at least I used to, but I'm a sex guy. This kind of project requires a sex guy, a physicist, the lab techs, real statisticians, real neuroimagers, real neuroanatomists, physicists. Which is what made it so exciting for me to get an invitation to come here, is that this is one of the only other places in the world that has each of those pieces. So rather than being me and a bunch of Germans, me, a bunch of Germans, and a couple of New Mexicans, a bunch of New Mexicans, that would be exciting. Oh, that means I'm done. Would you believe that was 100 slots? And I didn't even use my New York speed of questions, other stuff I can tell you. Meetings you have to run to. Yep.
Will you be expanding into research with women? I realize there's a smaller population, obviously. But...
Yep. There's no good evidence that there's such a thing as a female pedophile. There are female child molesters. There's no evidence to suggest that they're genuinely into kids in a sexual orientation kind of a way, the way that men are. For men, it's actually a puzzle. The structure of female sexual orientation is entirely unlike that of men. It's one of the unfortunate side effects of the feminist movement of the 70s. Men have to be just like women. Women have to be just like men. We're not. For men, that's hot, that's not. And that's really pretty much all it takes. For women, it's this global, integrated, it depends on context, expectations for the future, it's this whole big, what do my friends think? It's just that, and women are genuinely not aroused if all of those stars don't align. It's just not like. So it's almost as if the male system is just what the object looks like. If something's wrong with that system, you're not off to the races, you're a pedophile. But if something's wrong with the female feature detection response system, all those other parts are still there. And might either compensate, contribute, protect. That's my best guess. But female sexuality is fascinating because it's not at all what anything, including feminist activists, say it is. Yep.
So James, I was wondering, so as one comes to hold the belief, for example, that a child is an object of asexual desired object, in my experience, a lot of, and this might be related to low IQ, so it might have been more related to that, but what's been the literature on assessing formal thought disorder or disorganized thinking in individuals? Because in a lot of the pedophiles I've worked with, their thinking is almost like it's a false belief, it's a delusion, and it's very analogous to some people with other sexual-based, or deviant-based delusions, like the guy that thought Sylvester Stallone was his father. We talked about last night. Very funny story.
Usually when I get
except for Sylvester Stallone.
The impression I get from most of them is that their sexual attractions seem so natural to them that they need to work backwards to why does everybody else think differently.
Right.
To them, in the treatment literature, usually they'll refer to it as not cognitive distraction, a cognitive distortion. That in order to justify their own behavior, if they can convince themselves that the kid's into it, that's their. Where's on? It's just like it's like getting over disgust. They have to get over the idea that they want the kid to be into it. They want this to be a relationship. They're starving for signs of a reciprocal, because they have no interest in adults. So any ambiguous stimulus from the kid or phrase, they just fit into this cognitively distorted, twisted, backwards engineered way of looking at the kids. There is also, however, I'll call it the NAMBLA phenomenon. A bunch of adults who are into teens. And there do exist teens who are kind of flirtatious for whatever reasons. Sometimes it's an exaggerated version of into teacher. And so they kind of take that situation, and because it's what they want the truth to be, they kind of convince themselves that that is what the truth is, when really, when it's a teenager, flirtatious, experimenting, crush on teacher kind of, but to the pedophile who wants it to be real, they see it as real. The other one that they do a lot with cognitive distortion is, they call it emotional congruence. These pedos, they show up in our lab with their appointment, lawyer sends them, and they'll show up in a Porky Pig t-shirt. They feel like they have some special bond or understanding of the kid. There's something Peter Pan-ish about them. And in their desire, they're feeling that they're normal and it's the rest of society who's failing to recognize the innate natural sexuality of children. Right. It just kind of feeds into this fantasy of how they want reality to be because it helps them make sense of why they're different. So I haven't seen any evidence that it's a general thought disorder. They don't seem to have this within their interpretations of any other relationships other than, the floridly, comorbid actual thought disorders. But usually it's just backwards engineering their thinking in order to help them see what they want to see, to disinhibit's not quite the right word, but give themselves permission. It's just between you and me, don't tell anyone else, because they want to understand that you and I have something special. I know what it's usually that kind of a dynamic. So they do believe it, but I haven't seen any real evidence that it's general thought disorder. It's very specific to it's much more psychological, and I never say that. Other stuff. Like I said to everyone else, I don't know why everyone isn't a sex researcher. Yep.
I've been thinking about the diversity of the paraphilias in the context of the theory that it's a general sexual circuit that is responding to something it shouldn't. Mm-hmm. And how does that, is it that system is vulnerable at a time in someone's life when something specific happens and maybe that cements that specific association? Or how, what would be
Excellent question. It's one of the great debates. When people who later in life are paraphilic, they very, very often can describe the first time they remember, they saw the shoe and it changed their lives. Or at least that's how they describe it. But although they and naive psychologists do say, there was something special, there was imprinting, and then they pull in whatever ancient theory and they develop a causal mechanism. But it's also possible that, the brain was just kind of going along, and when it was ready to, glom onto something, they knew that, well, it was supposed to be kind of feminine. The pieces were there, but instead of getting her and her legs, it missed. And so we sometimes call those erotic target dislocations. That the paraphiles are not interested in random things. We don't get paraphilias for cameras, for trees, for cement blocks. We only get it for things that are about the body products, hair, urine, it's a foot, so it's humanoid. It's kind of like they were aiming, or the brain or evolution was aiming and just missed the target.
And is there a commonality in the time at which the time period in their lives at which the person remembers that? I'm guessing there wouldn't have to be, but it doesn't have to be one specific time period that system was vulnerable, like the beginning of adolescence, for example. It could just be.
Most of them, they vary. Most of them say that they definitely knew by puberty. Some of them, before that, just had a fascination. But I think that's just their version of regular everyday. So they talk to a regular, heterosexual guy. He won't actually have, an adult kind of a sex drive, but he'll be fascinated with breasts when he's 8. So it's the same kind of. They'll be dressing up in shoes. They'll be approximating, but it hasn't really yet. And then once testosterone fires in and the system becomes really responsive, that's really the first time. That's what gives them the flash memory. Right? And so, although sometimes they will talk about that as the cause, to me that's just, that was the brightest blip that gave them, that really crystallized it in their own minds. But we have no real evidence that it's genuinely causal. Those standing up means we're out of time?
No, they're still sitting. I'm not holding them back. There's more questions.
Excellent. Yeah. What else? As my grandmother used to say, and I still use it a lot when I talk about paraphilias, there is a lid for every pot. Now, what nobody ever talks about is what about the paraphilias that can't be expressed? Somebody who's into, the giantesses they're into, or miniature. There's one called aurophilia. They want to be consumed. Not eaten like a cannibal, they want to be swallowed whole, and sometimes shit out. If that's your sexual orientation, what do you do with these people? They're fascinating. Unfortunate. I don't know why everybody's in sex research. One of the next groups I wanted to, I was about to say, a group I want to do. Some of the groups I want to study are the diaper fetishists. Now, the diaper fetishists to me are fascinating in that it's kind of like inside-out pedophilia. Instead of being attracted to the kid, they want to be the kid. In their sexual fantasies, when they hire a prostitute, it's a very large woman who can kind of help them create the illusion or evoke the feeling that they're infant. There's a fascinating paraphilia called autogynephilia. Rather than being attracted to women, they're attracted to the idea of being a woman. And that's one of the primary motivators behind transsexualism. They really want to do everything they can to be as feminine as they can. We have, zoophiles, and then some autozoophilia. These are looking at the plushy costumes and the furry costumes of they hold conventions, often in Las Vegas. What they don't talk about a lot, they're trying to put their best paw forward. They don't talk about how many sex parties there are, and they're in costumes in whatever their various characters are. They want to be the furry animal, the sheep. So what is it that, there's a pattern here that's nobody's ever talked about. The study, I don't know if I'll ever get around to it, but I would love to. Okay, if I'm thinking white matter already, if I take this whole group of we call them, there's more than one name, autoerotic paraphilias, or some people call them erotic target location errors, where they want to be the thing that they're into instead of being into the thing. Mirror neurons. No idea if it's related, but it's the first place I want to look. It's just something about, rather than imitating the thing, it's kind of like they internalized the imitation. It's like their orientation is the imitation of whatever it is that otherwise that. I don't know why everybody's got a sex research.
So on that note, I suspect you're probably going to ask me to take the mobile to Vegas. So we're risking any convention. But let's thank James.